Beneath a sky brushed in the faintest hues of dawn, the village of Elderwin slumbered at the edge of the silvermere, a lake so still and ancient that the elders said it remembered every voice ever whispered to its waters. It was a place both revered and quietly feared, for though its glassy surface shone with a serenity that calmed the restless heart, there were tales, as old as the stones upon which the village was built, that spoke of voices beneath the water, of songs that drifted from the depths on moonlit nights when the mist lay thick and the world seemed hushed in expectation. Mira Tamson, a woman who had long passed the days when youthful dreams might have carried her beyond the village borders, found herself standing by the shore one such morning, the hem of her wool cloak trailing in dew-dampened grass, her hands wrapped around a wooden box older than she could remember owning. She had awoken before first light, her sleep broken by a sound so soft and distant it might have been a dream, the faint chiming of bells or perhaps a melody hummed from a long-forgotten cradle song. And without questioning why, she had risen, drawn to the silvermere as though an old promise was calling her back. The village had changed little in her lifetime. Its cobblestone lanes wound between weathered homes whose shutters bore the paint of generations, and the bells in the tower still chimed the same deep, measured tones as they had when she was a girl. Yet Mira often felt as though she had faded into the rhythm of the place rather than belonged to it, her years unfolding like a page half read. Her husband Tom had passed quietly 3 winters before, and their son Callan had long since taken a trader's road eastward, writing only seldom, his letters smelling faintly of spice and sea salt. But here, now standing at the lake's edge, she felt something shift, a quiet knowing that perhaps she was not as forgotten by the world as she had once believed. The box in her hands was warm, though the morning was cold. It had been her grandmother's once, and it bore carvings of twisting vines and tiny birds in flight, though she could not remember where it had been kept all these years. She did not open it yet. Instead, she looked out across the silvermere, where mist curled and drifted over water like pale ribbons, and she listened. It was not the wind she heard, nor the call of morning birds, but a sound deeper and older, a hum that seemed to vibrate through the stones beneath her boots, a resonance that made the air feel alive with memory. As the first rays of sunlight struck the surface of the lake, the mists parted in places, revealing faint shapes that might have been stones, or the shadows of ancient trees drowned long ago, or perhaps something more. Stories had long told of the city beneath the silvermere, a place where towers of white stone glimmered like bone and bells tolled without hands to ring them, where those who were lost might be found again if only they could listen closely enough. Mira had not thought of such tales in many years. They had been for the fireside, told in winters when the snow lay thick and the wind whispered secrets down chimney flues. And yet, as she stood there now, she felt the weight of those stories settle upon her shoulders, not as burden, but as belonging. Slowly she knelt at the water's edge and set the box upon a flat stone that jutted out toward the lake like a beckoning finger. Her fingers, knotted and stiff, undid the simple clasp, and inside she found a folded scrap of paper, brittle with age, but still bearing the clear script of her grandmother's hand. "When the time comes," it read, "listen for the bells. Follow the silver path." Mira smiled, though tears stung her eyes. The bells, yes, she had heard them, or something like them. And the silver path? She looked up, squinting into the growing light, and there it was, a narrow trail of rippling brightness that stretched from where she knelt to the center of the lake, as though moonlight itself had spilled and lingered on the water. Without quite knowing why, she rose and stepped forward. The path was not solid, but neither did it sink beneath her weight. It felt instead as though she walked upon something that held her gently, like a hand offered in trust. Behind her, the village still slept, unaware. But ahead lay something waiting. The air was thick with silence, yet she was not afraid. Her feet moved steadily, carrying her farther from shore than she had ever ventured, and the mist closed softly behind her, sealing her in a world of pale light and quiet song. As she walked, shapes began to form beneath the water's surface, arches and spires, faint and shimmering, as if she gazed through a veil into another world. She could not be certain, but she thought she saw movement as well, figures gliding slowly, their arms outstretched, their faces turned upward toward her. They were neither frightening nor strange, but familiar, in a way that tugged at her heart. She thought she recognized one, a man's face, kind and patient. Thomas. Her breath caught, but she did not stop walking. The path led her to a place where the air grew warmer, and the water, dark and deep, shone with an inner light. There, waiting, was a circle of stone rising just above the surface, and within it a pedestal carved from smooth black rock. Upon the pedestal rested a single bell, its surface etched with symbols she almost remembered, but could not quite name. She stood before it, feeling a weight settle in her chest, not heavy, but full of everything she had lost and everything she might yet find again. And then, as though guided by hands unseen, she reached out and rang the bell. Its sound was unlike any she had ever heard, rich and deep, like the voice of the earth itself, speaking across time. It echoed outward, rippling over the lake and through the mists, and as it did, the shapes beneath the water rose, their forms growing clearer, more solid. Faces emerged, some she knew, some she did not, each one shining with gentle light. They did not speak, but their presence was a comfort deeper than words. Mira felt a warmth bloom in her chest, filling the hollow places left by years of silence and solitude. This was not an end, she realized, but a beginning she had never expected. And when she turned to look back toward Elderwin, the mists parted once more, and the village stood golden in the morning light, as if awakened by the bell's call. She took a breath, tasting salt and sweetness on the air, and smiled. When Mira returned to Elderwin from the silvermere's glistening path, something within her had shifted, though it was difficult to name. The morning light stretched long over cobblestone streets and slate rooftops, and though the village had always seemed quietly watchful in the hours before sunrise, this time it felt as though every shuttered window and crooked chimney were holding its breath, waiting for something only Mira could see. She carried the wooden box back with her, cradling it against her chest like a heartbeat newly found. Her hands, still trembling from what she had seen, what she had felt at the lake's heart, moved on their own as she let herself into her small home at the edge of the village square. The hinges groaned softly as the door swung open, releasing the familiar scent of dried herbs and old oak timbers, and she stepped inside, pausing for a moment in the quiet. There was no one waiting in the chair by the hearth, no soft hum of Tom's old tune drifting through the air. Yet she did not feel alone. She set the box down on the long-forgotten table that had belonged to her grandfather, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. As the kettle simmered over the revived fire, she unfastened the box once more, her fingers brushing the fragile paper with her grandmother's words. Beneath it, carefully wrapped in oilskin, lay something heavier, a small, leather-bound journal. She hesitated before lifting it out. Her grandfather's journal. She remembered seeing him with it once when she was a child, his gnarled hands resting atop its cracked cover, his gaze distant, as though listening to something only he could hear. He had died in his sleep not long after, his passing marked by a simple service and a deep silence that settled into the corners of their home like dust. Mira had thought the journal lost, or perhaps buried with him, but here it was, waiting quietly. She untied the string that bound it, her breath catching at the scent that rose, dry parchment, old ink, and something else beneath it all like rain on stone. The first pages were filled with his looping script, each letter carefully formed, though the ink had faded in places. She began to read, her eyes following the slow unraveling of a story she had never known was his. He wrote of dreams first, visions that came to him in his youth, long before Mira had been born, dreams of a city beneath the water, its towers reaching toward him as though remembering his name. He spoke of walking paths made of light and of hearing bells toll from places no man's voice had touched in living memory. "The silvermere calls to those who remember," he had written. "It waits for those whose hearts still carry the song." Mira's throat tightened as she read on, tracing his words with fingers that trembled more from understanding than from age. He told of a time when he too had stood at the edge of the water, much as she had, carrying a box left to him by his grandmother. Within it had been the same folded note, though the message had varied slightly. "When the hour is upon us, walk the path unseen and remember your name." Mira closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. The journal's pages turned more easily after that, as if welcoming her into its secrets. There were sketches, too, maps of the village as it had once been, symbols scrawled in margins that echoed the Marken. She had seen on the stones around the silvermere's pedestal. He had charted stars, circled dates that aligned with phases of the moon, and listed names. People who had vanished, or so the village had believed. Her grandfather spoke of them not as lost souls, but as watchers, guardians of balance between their world and what he called the city beneath. Mira remembered the old tales, half-whispered stories of a time when Elderwin had been a place of learning and magic, its people deeply connected to the mysteries of the world around them. That connection had faded with time, worn thin by war, plague, and grief, until only shadowed stories remained, kept alive by a few persistent voices around firesides. Yet here in his words was proof that the stories had never been mere fancies. Her grandfather had been a keeper, though no one had known, not even Mira. And now the weight of that knowledge passed to her. As she turned another page, her eyes fell upon an entry marked with a red ribbon, unfaded despite its age. The ink here was darker, as though written in urgency. "The balance shifts," he had written. "I hear the bells more often now. The mists grow restless, and the city beneath stirs. I cannot go again. My body is failing, but someone must. If you find this, know that the path is not yet closed." Beneath it was a simple line that sent a shiver down Mira's spine. "The lake remembers." She sat back in her chair, the fire's warmth forgotten as she stared at the page. There was something unfinished in his words, something left undone. And though Mira had walked the silver path and rung the bell, she knew in her marrow that it had only been the beginning. Her grandfather's journal was both warning and guide. She glanced toward the window where the light of late morning now spilled onto the cobbles. Elder wind stirred to life outside, merchants arranging goods, children racing along narrow lanes, and the low murmur of voices familiar and comforting. But beneath it all, Mira sensed the echo of another world pressing close. She had not been the first to walk the path, and she would not be the last. The remaining pages of the journal detailed instructions, rituals meant to strengthen the bond between the two worlds, to keep the veil from thinning too far. Herbs to gather at midsummer, symbols to carve on stones at crossroads, words to be spoken beneath the new moon's dark eye. Mira traced the diagrams with careful study, her pulse steadying as the pieces of an old purpose began to take shape in her mind. Tom had never believed in such things, though he had smiled and humored her stories. And Callan had left long ago. But she was not alone. The bells had called her. The city beneath had shown itself. And the journal was proof that she had a role to play in what was to come. Later that day, she visited the graveyard behind the old chapel. The stones there were weathered and worn, their inscriptions softened by time. She found her grandfather's marker easily, set beneath the old yew tree where the crows gathered in the early hours. Kneeling, she laid her hand upon the cold stone, the journal clutched in her other arm. "I found it," she whispered. "I understand now." The wind shifted as if in answer, stirring the yew's heavy branches. She stayed there for a long time, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant toll of the chapel bell. It no longer seemed like just another hour marked. It was a reminder. As the sun slipped lower, Mira walked home, the journal held close. The village greeted her quietly, neighbors lifting their hands in silent greeting, old friends offering nods as they tended gardens and hung washing. Elderwin, she thought, was still half asleep, unaware of what stirred beneath its foundations. But they would know soon enough. At home, she gathered what her grandfather's writings had listed: smooth stones from the riverbed, a length of silvered thread, herbs dried and ground into powder. She set them carefully upon the old table and began her work, whispering the words as she mixed and bound the elements together. When she finished, she placed the stones in a ring upon the window-sill, where they caught the last rays of the sun and seemed to glow faintly. That night she dreamed not of the city beneath, but of Elderwin itself, its streets and rooftops gleaming silver, its people walking without fear toward the lake's edge, their hands joined in understanding. And in the distance the bells rang again, clear and bright as morning, the following morning, as soft beams of light filtered through the old lace curtains of Thomas's cottage. A quiet knock came at the door, gentle but persistent enough to stir him from his reading. His fingers, still resting upon the worn leather cover of his father's journal, lingered for a moment longer before he rose and crossed the room with measured steps. He knew the knock before he opened the door, had known it even before it sounded. The rhythm, the subtle hesitation followed by certainty. And there she was, Lily. His granddaughter stood on the weathered stone stoop, her arms wrapped loosely around a basket half filled with wildflowers, her copper-colored hair catching the morning light like burnished thread. She smiled at him in that quiet way of hers, a smile that seemed to understand things before they were spoken aloud, and Thomas felt his chest tighten with an emotion he could not name. "I thought I'd bring you some early blooms," she said, holding out the basket, though he knew the flowers were only a small part of her reason for coming. He stepped aside wordlessly, allowing her to enter. She set the basket on the table, her sharp green eyes immediately catching sight of the journal, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. It was she who broke the silence. "You've been reading it again," Lily said, though there was no accusation in her tone, only curiosity, and something else beneath it. Hope, perhaps, or belief. Thomas exhaled slowly, returning to his chair by the hearth as she took the one opposite. "It's an old man's foolishness," he murmured, though his hand still rested protectively upon the book. "These are stories meant for the young. You'll find more sense in the world outside Elderwin." Lily tilted her head, studying him. "I've found sense," she answered softly, "but not wonder. And you've always had that, grandfather, even when you tried to hide it." Her words stirred something long buried. He thought of the days when he had first seen the mist rise over Silvermere, when his father's voice had whispered of bells tolling beneath the water, and how he had once believed the world was far larger and stranger than anyone dared admit. But belief had faded with time, replaced by duty and loss and the hollow weight of unanswered questions. And yet now, as Lily reached for the journal and gently opened its pages, Thomas found himself leaning forward as if his hands itched to trace the familiar writing alongside hers. She read in silence for several minutes, her brow furrowed in concentration, then closed the book with careful reverence and met his gaze once more. "Why did you stop looking?" she asked. Her voice was not unkind, but it struck him all the same. Thomas rubbed his thumb along the edge of the chair's worn arm. "Because I couldn't find it," he said simply, "because I thought I had imagined it all, the dreams, the bells, the glimpses of something beneath the water. None of it led anywhere, and after a time I convinced myself it was better left alone." Lily was quiet for a long moment, then reached out and covered his hand with her own. "What if it's still waiting?" she asked. "What if it needs you to try again?" Her touch was warm and steady, and Thomas found himself remembering the way his father had once grasped his own hand and spoken of legacy, not of wealth or name, but of memory, of belonging to something greater than a single life. He looked into Lily's eyes and saw not a child's fancifulness, but determination. The same determination that had once driven him to walk the Silvermere's edge night after night in search of answers. Without quite realizing it, he nodded. That afternoon they began to prepare. The old satchel Thomas had not touched in decades was unearthed from the back of a cupboard, its leather stiff but serviceable. Together they filled it with what they might need: candles, a tinderbox, a compass long unused but still true. Lily brought her own additions: a small notebook for sketching and notes, a length of silken cord, and a silver pendant she wore close to her heart. She pressed it into his hand as they packed, explaining softly that it had belonged to her mother, Thomas's daughter, and that it might offer protection or guidance, though she wasn't sure how. He accepted it wordlessly, tucking it carefully into the inner pocket of his coat. The preparations were methodical but unhurried, the quiet rhythm of their shared work drawing them closer than they had been in years. When they paused for a simple supper of bread and broth, Thomas found himself telling Lily stories of Elderwin's past, of the old market where traders once came from distant lands, of the harvest festivals where lanterns floated like stars upon the river. She listened with rapt attention, and when he faltered in memory, she supplied the names and places, having remembered what he had once told her as a child. He realized, as they sat together by the firelight, that she had been listening all along, even when he had thought himself alone in his remembering. By evening, they stood at the edge of Elderwin Square, the satchel slung across Thomas's shoulder and Lily at his side. The village was quiet in the dusky light, and though a few neighbors glanced their way, none spoke or questioned their intent. It was as if the town itself understood something was being set right after long silence. They walked the path toward Silvermere without speaking.
The village was quiet in the dusky light, and though a few neighbors glanced their way, none spoke or questioned their intent. It was as if the town itself understood something was being set right after long silence. They walked the path toward Silvermere without speaking, their footsteps softened by moss and leaf litter. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of water and something older still, a hint of stone and silence, of memory waiting beneath the surface. When they reached the lake, Lily drew in a slow breath. She had been here before, of course, but never like this. Thomas watched her take in, the glassy surface reflecting a sky awash in fading gold, the mist that clung low and shifting, as though alive. "It doesn't seem so frightening," Lily murmured. Thomas smiled faintly. "It never did," he replied, "but it was never entirely safe either." They stood together at the shoreline for a time, their hands brushing, neither quite ready to step forward and break the stillness. Finally, Lily turned to him, her expression clear and sure. "We're not going to find anything standing here," she said, and Thomas found himself laughing softly despite the weight in his chest. "No," he agreed. "No, we won't." He took the first step, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, and Lily followed close behind. They moved carefully at first, though there was no path to guide them, only instinct and memory. But as the moon rose and silvered the world around them, the faintest shimmer began to appear on the lake's surface. Lines of light, faint as breath, crisscrossed the water and extended toward a point just beyond the old stone marker, half hidden by reeds. Thomas's breath caught. "There," he whispered, pointing. Lily's fingers tightened on his arm, her excitement plain. They followed the light, step by step, until the shimmer solidified beneath their feet. The path of light, once only legend and dream, now lay solid and sure beneath them, extending toward the lake's heart. Thomas glanced at Lily, seeing both fear and wonder in her eyes, and felt his own heart steady. Together, they stepped onto the path, the silver glow rising around their boots, but holding firm. The mist swirled higher, veiling them from the world they had left behind, and as they walked, Thomas thought he heard the faint toll of a bell, distant but clear. Lily heard it too. He saw her head lift sharply, saw her lips move in silent wonder. The journal had spoken true. The path was open. And as they made their way forward, hand in hand, Thomas felt the years fall away. He was no longer an old man chasing shadows, but a keeper walking in his father's footsteps, joined now by his granddaughter, whose belief had rekindled his own. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The city beneath was waiting. The path of silver light faded as Thomas and Lily reached the heart of Silvermere, where the waters had once swallowed entire villages and legends alike. Yet the lake had not claimed them this night. The faint glow lingered at their feet before dissolving into darkened ripples, as if it had delivered them to the threshold of something ancient and unseen. They stood in silence, hand in hand, their breath visible in the cold mist. Around them, the world was hushed, except for a distant, rhythmic sound, the slow pulse of water against stone. The journal had mentioned such a place, a crossing where water met rock, where the cliffs rose like sentinels above the deep. Thomas turned his gaze toward the looming shadows that curved along the lake's far edge. The cliffs, known to old maps as Wraith's Reach, had always seemed unreachable by foot. But the path had led them here, and now he saw what had been hidden before, a narrow way, carved into the side of the stone wall, slick with age, but solid underfoot. He exchanged a glance with Lily, whose expression was full of the same cautious determination he himself felt. Without words, they pressed onward, their fingers trailing along the cold rock as they climbed, the sounds of the lake below falling away into muffled quiet. As they ascended, Thomas thought about the stories his father once told of the Bell of Tides, an artifact from the city beneath, forged in an age when men and the sea spoke as kin. His father had claimed the bell could call the waters themselves, commanding the tides to rise or fall, and that it rang only when the moon was right, as if in harmony with the pulse of the earth. He'd never known whether it was truth or myth. But now, with the journal's pages guiding them, he suspected both things were true. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky as they climbed higher, a pale lantern casting their shadows against the rock face. Lily led for a time, her footing sure, and Thomas watched her in silent admiration. She reminded him of his daughter, the same grace, the same fearless heart. At last, they reached a narrow ledge that widened unexpectedly into a hollow, sheltered by an overhang of black stone. In the center of the hollow stood a weathered structure, a stone arch, half swallowed by moss and lichen, its surface carved with symbols that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Suspended from the arch by thick chains of tarnished silver was the bell that was smaller than Thomas expected, yet its presence seemed vast, as though it filled the entire space with a silent song. The metal was dark, nearly black, though veins of blue and green shimmered faintly along its surface, colors that reminded him of deep water and kelp forests swaying in unseen currents. The clapper hung motionless within, but there was a weight to it, a sense that something ancient slept within its hollow shell. Lily approached first, her fingers trailing over the chain as she studied the symbols. "Tide markings," she murmured, glancing back at Thomas. "They are like the ones in the journal's margins." He stepped closer, his old eyes narrowing as he examined the carvings. She was right. The journal had made mention of these, lines denoting phases of the moon, marks for high and low water, and beneath them a name. "Calindra," he whispered, reading the inscription aloud. His breath seemed to stir the air, and for a moment he thought he heard an answering hum deep in the stone. "The moon caller," Lily said softly, recalling the tale. She who sang to the tides and knew their secret paths. They stood in silence for a moment longer, Thomas's hand resting on the journal in his coat, Lily's on the chain. Then she turned to him with a quiet certainty. "We should ring it," she said. Thomas hesitated. His father had warned that the bell did not merely summon the tide, it called forth what lay sleeping beneath it. But then they had come this far, and the journal had led them to this place for a reason. Slowly, reverently, they moved together to grip the chain. The metal was cold beneath their fingers, but it pulsed faintly, as if in recognition of their touch. They pulled, slowly at first, feeling the weight of the bell resist them. Then, with a groaning sound, the clapper swung forward and struck the bell's inner wall. The sound that followed was unlike anything Thomas had ever heard. It was not a simple tone, but a deep, resonant call that seemed to travel not just through the air, but through the bones of the earth itself. It shivered along his spine and filled his chest with a vibration that was both comforting and unsettling, as if the world were waking from a deep slumber. The air changed. The mist that had clung to the cliffs began to swirl, coiling into delicate spirals before streaming toward the lake. The water below responded as if alive. The surface darkened, shifting from calm reflection to churning movement. Long, Deep ripples spread outward from the cliffs, and somewhere far below, a deep rumbling echoed upward through the rock. Lily tightened her grip on Thomas's hand, but there was no fear in her expression, only wonder. "It's working," she said. And it was. The journal had described the bell of tides as the key to awakening the path to the city beneath. The tolling sound echoed again, softer this time, but persistent, like a heartbeat rising from the deep. The water along the shoreline began to recede, drawing back as if exhaled by an unseen force. Exposed now was a path of smooth stone, slick with algae and studded with faintly glowing shells. It wound away from the base of the cliffs and into the heart of Silvermere, toward a point that shimmered faintly in the moon's light. "We should follow it," Lily said, her voice hushed with awe. Thomas nodded, though part of him trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of long-held hope stirring to life. They descended carefully, the bell's song still thrumming through the air. As they reached the newly revealed pathway, the lake water lapped gently at the edges, no longer turbulent but calm, as if awaiting their steps. They moved forward, the stones firm beneath their boots. The water on either side was impossibly clear now, and as they walked, Thomas thought he saw shapes moving beneath the surface, curved arches like ribs, great pillars encrusted with coral, and what might have been windows of buildings long since submerged. Lily saw them too, her gaze darting from one form to another as they passed. "The city beneath," she murmured almost reverently. But this was only the threshold. The bell's toll had stirred the waters, drawing away the tide to reveal what had been hidden. Yet Thomas sensed they were not yet fully within the city's heart. The journal had spoken of more trials, of guardians and keys, of songs that needed to be sung. At the end of the stone path stood a wide platform, its surface marked with a great spiral, similar to the ones carved on the bell. A pillar rose from the center, holding a basin filled with water that shimmered with an inner light. Lily approached first, peering into its depths. "It's not water," she said softly. Thomas joined her and saw that she was right. The liquid within was thicker, luminous, and it pulsed faintly, as if alive. "Moon water," he whispered, recalling the stories. "The tears of Calindra." According to the journal, this basin was the second key. It held the memory of tides and was said to guide those who sought the city's gate. Lily cupped her hands, dipping them into the moon water. It glowed softly against her skin as she brought it to her lips. Thomas hesitated only a moment before doing the same. The liquid was cool and smooth, filling him with a strange warmth. The moment he swallowed, the world shifted. The path behind them disappeared, swallowed once more by water. But before them, a great archway shimmered into view, woven of light and mist, its form inscribed with symbols that pulsed in rhythm with their heartbeats. Thomas and Lily exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. They had come this far, and there was no turning back. Together, they stepped forward toward the arch, its light washing over them. As they crossed the threshold, Thomas thought he heard another sound rising from the depths below, a choir of voices, ancient and full of longing, singing a song that echoed through the ages. The city beneath was calling them home. At dawn, the air hung heavy with expectation, and a silvery mist blurred the line between sky and sea. Thomas and Lily stood on the narrow wooden jetty where the lake merged with the distant ocean, their small boat bobbing gently with the rhythm of the waking tide. Neither spoke as they loaded the final supplies, 2 oxygen tanks, the polished brass lanterns Thomas had refurbished the night before, and the old compass whose needle spun curiously when pointed towards Silvermere's heart. The journal, wrapped carefully in oilskin, lay tucked beneath Lily's seat, its pages marked and studied, its mysteries beckoning them forward. As they pushed off from the jetty, the water, usually dark and glassy, shimmered with an unusual silver sheen. Lily's eyes reflected the same light, bright with wonder but steady with resolve. They rowed in silence at first, the faint creak of oars and the splash of water the only sounds in the stillness. The farther they drifted from the shoreline, the more the lake seemed to transform. The water deepened, not just in color but in texture, taking on an otherworldly quality, as if they crossed into a different realm. Schools of fish with iridescent scales glided beneath them, flashes of living light that painted shifting patterns on the hull. Strange shapes loomed below, arches, pillars, and skeletal frameworks swallowed by time, hints of structures too symmetrical to be natural. Thomas paused his rowing, lifting his gaze to Lily. She said nothing, but he could feel her pulse quicken as she adjusted her gear. They had reached the place described in the journal, the threshold of depths, where the water gleamed silver even in shadow, and where those who dared to descend might find the truth or be lost to it forever. Securing their masks and tightening the straps of their tanks, they checked the lanterns one last time. The brass frames, polished to a golden sheen, reflected the growing light of the rising sun. Thomas held one aloft and saw the flame flicker to life inside, steady and warm despite the dampness in the air. It was said the lanterns, fueled by old oils refined from deep-sea kelp, would burn even in the blackest waters. He hoped that was true. Lily grinned, the expression bright even behind her mask, and gave him a thumbs up. Together, they slipped over the side of the boat and into the water. At first, the descent was gentle, the surface light filtering through in wavering ribbons of gold. Fish darted between them, long, slender creatures with trailing fins that rippled like silk. But as they went deeper, the light faded, and the world turned dark and quiet. Their lanterns cut swaths through the gloom, illuminating strange growths on submerged walls and doorways partially swallowed by coral. The ruins hinted at great plazas and avenues now half buried in silt. Columns encrusted with barnacles leaned precariously, their carved surfaces obscured by centuries of sea life. And then, beyond a broken archway, they saw it, a massive relief carved into a stone wall, depicting an ancient city crowned with towers like shells and spires that rose in spirals toward the sky. Creatures half human, half fish swam among the carvings, their eyes rendered in inlaid pearls that gleamed faintly in their lantern light. Lily hovered beside the relief, reaching out with one gloved hand to trace the lines. Thomas marveled at her steady breath and focus. She pointed toward an inscription, a familiar symbol from the journal, a spiral within a circle, the mark of Calindra. They followed the relief downward into a cavernous space where the remains of wide steps descended into darkness. Here the current was stronger, pulling them forward as if urging them deeper. They passed under stone bridges still miraculously intact, and through what might have been a marketplace long ago, where stone stalls stood empty, their wares long since claimed by the sea. Here fish with luminous eyes circled slowly, unafraid, their bodies trailing tendrils of soft light. Thomas thought of the stories his father told, of a people who once lived in harmony with the ocean, breathing its waters as easily as air. The deeper they went, the more he believed it was true. At the lowest point of the ruins they could see, they found a courtyard paved with tiles that shimmered like mother of pearl. At its center rose a statue, tall and graceful, with arms outstretched as if in welcome or warning. Its face was serene, and Thomas realized it was the same figure from the relief above, Calindra, the moon caller. The statue's hands held bowls carved from translucent stone, and within them glowed orbs of pale blue light. As Lily approached, the orbs brightened, their glow reflecting in her wide eyes. Thomas felt something shift in the water around them, a soft pulse, almost like a heartbeat. He tightened his grip on the lantern as the pulse deepened into a low hum that seemed to vibrate through his bones. And then, from the shadows at the courtyard's edge, movement. Shapes emerged, figures tall and fluid, their bodies glimmering faintly like moonlight on water. Their eyes were luminous, and they moved with a grace that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Lily froze, but she did not back away. One of the figures drifted closer, tilting its head, as if studying her. Thomas instinctively reached for her shoulder, but Lily shook her head gently. The figure extended a hand toward her, long fingers webbed and pale. In its palm was a small, spiraled shell. Lily took it slowly, her hands steady despite the rush of her breathing. The moment her fingers closed around it, the hum in the water deepened, and the figures withdrew, fading back into the gloom as silently as they had appeared. Thomas exhaled slowly, the bubbles rising past his mask in a silver stream. They were guardians, he realized, keepers of the city, watchers of those who sought its heart. The journal had spoken of them, but words could not capture the eerie majesty of their presence. Lily held the shell close, and Thomas saw faint lines of light radiating from its spiral, matching the pulse of their lanterns. They had been given a key, though what door it opened, he could not yet guess. They lingered only a moment longer in the courtyard before moving on, the current now guiding them down another passage where faint glimmers of gold and silver danced along the walls. They swam side by side through the narrow corridors of the deep city, where the stones whispered ancient songs in the dark. Occasionally, Thomas glanced at Lily and saw something in her eyes, an understanding, a connection growing deeper with each stroke through the water. They were not just explorers now, they were part of something far older than themselves, woven into the story of the city they sought to uncover. As they followed the glowing spiral of light leading deeper still, Thomas felt a strange sense of peace. They were no longer outsiders. They had been welcomed, the passage narrowed, then opened suddenly into a vast expanse, and Thomas and Lily floated in awe at the threshold of what could only be the heart of the legend, Eloria. The misty waters thinned here, not in substance but in presence, as if they had passed through some hidden veil. Before them, stretching far beyond the beams of their lanterns, rose marble towers and sweeping arches untouched by time or decay. The city was whole. Not ruins, not wreckage, but a metropolis held in quiet suspension, as if waiting for someone to wake it. Thomas instinctively reached for Lily's arm as they hovered together, the weight of generations pressing on their shoulders in that singular moment. The waters carried a faint glow, the source unclear at first until they realized it emanated from the city itself. The marble of Eloria shimmered with a pale, internal light, veins of silver and pearl running through the stone, and statues of graceful figures lined the avenues, each one poised as though mid-step, mid-breath. Some stood with arms lifted skyward, others knelt as if tending gardens long lost to the sea. Their faces were serene, not mournful, and Thomas felt no sorrow in them, only a sense of deep waiting, as if they knew someone would come. They drifted forward, their movements cautious yet reverent. The streets beneath them were paved with stones like liquid opal, smooth and flawless, each step reflecting a soft gleam from their lanterns. Schools of small, luminous fish flitted by like living stardust, their scales catching glints from the radiant buildings. The water itself felt warmer here, and though their breathing remained steady through their masks, Thomas sensed a strange easiness in his body, as though the sea had lightened its grip in this sacred space. They passed beneath a grand arch inscribed with familiar markings from a journal, a spiral flanked by 2 moons, and Lily glanced at him with wide eyes. She pointed to a symbol carved deep into the stone, Calindra's sigil, identical to the one on the shell she now wore on a cord at her throat. The shell glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the city's own breath like rhythm. The deeper they swam into Eloria, the clearer the architecture became. Towers crowned with domes of iridescent crystal reflected light in delicate rainbows, casting prismatic bands along the buildings and the sea floor. Doorways framed in mother-of-pearl stood open, revealing chambers beyond filled with elegant furnishings, their delicate curves designed to mimic waves and shells. Frescoes on the walls told stories in intricate detail, of people who danced beneath twin moons, of ships that sailed through silver waters, of creatures both familiar and strange, living in harmony with those who dwelled here. Lily trailed her fingers gently along one such mural, its surface cool and smooth beneath her gloves. Thomas watched her closely, seeing in her wonder something he himself had not dared feel in decades: belief. Not in stories or myths, but in something greater than either of them, something that connected them to this place as surely as blood. They entered what appeared to be a central plaza, where a great circular pool stood at its heart, its water still and clear despite the depth. In its center rose a statue larger than any they had yet seen, a woman with flowing hair that spread like seaweed behind her, her arms cradling a globe that shimmered with the faint light of a living pearl. Thomas recognized her immediately. Calindra, the moon caller. Her gaze was soft, yet filled with purpose. As they drew closer, the globe she held brightened, and from its surface emanated tiny streams of light that drifted outward, like filaments reaching toward them. They did not shy away. Lily extended her hand, and one filament coiled around her wrist gently, causing the shell she wore to glow even brighter. Thomas's heart pounded, though not from fear. The journal had hinted at this, the belief that Calindra's light would respond to those with pure intent. He extended his own hand, and soon his fingers were encircled in strands of light as well. The water around them vibrated faintly, like a great breath drawing in. Then, without warning, the currents shifted, and a soft, ringing sound filled the water. Not loud, not sharp, but musical, like the chime of silver bells heard from a great distance. It echoed through the city, carried by the currents, and in its wake, Thomas saw movement where before there had been stillness. Windows once dim flickered with soft illumination. Doorways once dark glowed faintly as if hearth fires had been rekindled. The statues that lined the streets now appeared less like stone and more like people frozen in a moment between sleep and waking. And then, in a sudden and gentle motion, the figure of Calindra tilted her head. It was not imagination. Lily gasped, bubbles streaming from her mask as she floated back, but Thomas did not move. The statue's gaze met his warm and knowing. He heard no words, but in his mind there was an impression, a welcome, an acknowledgement. They had come far. They had opened the door. The light grew stronger, enveloping them, not blinding, but soft like moonlight on still water. The currents that had once pulled at them now swirled protectively. Thomas felt an overwhelming peace settle over him, and as he turned to Lily, he saw tears suspended in her eyes. They were not tears of fear, but of belonging. They had found Eloria, and Eloria had found them. They remained in the plaza, hovering in the gentle glow, watching as the city breathed back to life in subtle ways. Fish gathered along pathways that had once served as streets. Coral bloomed anew on walls that had been bare moments before. In the distance, Thomas thought he saw figures moving, no longer stone, but real, gliding gracefully along avenues lined with ancient lamps. He squeezed Lily's hand, and together they understood. They were witnessing the city awakened as they drifted upward toward a higher terrace. The vista expanded before them. Towers stretched toward the unseen surface, their crystalline tops catching unseen starlight. Gardens of pale green and gold swayed with the currents, tended by figures whose movements were fluid and deliberate. There was no fear in these beings, only curiosity and quiet welcome. They were not intruders here. They were guests, and for the first time in many years, Thomas felt something return that he had thought long lost: hope. Thomas and Lily moved deeper into the heart of Eloria, their lanterns casting golden halos through the pale blue of the water. But increasingly, it was the faint glow of the city itself that guided them. Every passage they entered seemed to hum with quiet life, as if the walls themselves were remembering a time long past and sharing that memory in pulses of soft light and warmth. It was not just a city of stone and crystal. It was a place that breathed, that listened, and that seemed to recognize them, welcoming them as they explored its depths. As they swam down broad avenues lined with coral gardens and shellwork fountains, they began to notice murals etched into the gleaming walls, pictures carved with such exquisite detail that they appeared almost alive beneath the shifting light. Thomas paused before one such mural, letting the current carry him slowly past its length, his gloved hand hovering inches from the smooth stone. The carving told of a time when Eloria had been filled with song and light. Graceful figures stood beneath two moons, their arms lifted as ribbons of light danced between them like silk in the breeze. The expressions on their faces were serene, joyful, and there was a sense of deep harmony in the scene that made Thomas's chest ache with an emotion he hadn't expected, longing. Lily floated beside him in silence, her eyes wide and reflecting the faint luminescence of the carving. They could both feel it, the presence of the people who had lived here, a peaceful civilization whose story whispered through every ripple of the As they continued on, they found more murals, each one adding to the history that unfolded like an ancient song, its melody carried by the gentle currents. There were images of vast gatherings beneath vaulted halls of coral and pearl, of gardens where creatures swam and flew freely among the Elorians. The people in these carvings were tall and elegant, their features delicate and noble, their eyes filled with wisdom. They wore robes that shimmered with thread-like strands of light, and often they were depicted with their hands joined, forming circles as they stood at the edges of pools that reflected the twin moons above. One mural, larger than the rest, showed a council of figures standing around a great spiral shell. Its shape echoed in the architecture of the city itself. Thomas could almost hear their voices in the silence, low, harmonious, and filled with purpose. As they made decisions that shaped the course of their world, the deeper they ventured, the stronger the sense of presence became. It was as if the city was not merely inhabited by memories, but by echoes that remained sentient in some way. Thomas and Lily felt watched, but not in a way that unsettled them. It was a kind of benevolent awareness, as though unseen eyes followed them out of quiet curiosity, not suspicion. Once, as they passed through a colonnade where long, delicate strands of bioluminescent algae swayed like curtains, Thomas thought he heard faint voices, soft, melodic murmurs that seemed to rise from the very stones beneath his hands. He paused, glancing at Lily, and saw from her expression that she had heard them too. She turned slowly in the water, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the reach of their light. "They're still here," she whispered through the calms, her voice hushed despite the fact that they were alone. Thomas nodded. He felt it in his bones, that the Elorians had not truly vanished, that some part of them endured in this sanctuary beneath the one of the smaller plazas. They found what appeared to be a garden, though not like any they had ever seen. Slender stalks of coral rose like trees, their tips crowned with blossoms of iridescent light that pulsed gently in rhythm with the slow swell of the water. Between them, delicate creatures floated, small, translucent beings shaped like jellyfish, but with the unmistakable suggestion of faces, their features faint and shifting. These spirits, if that's what they were, drifted toward Thomas and Lily without fear. One brushed against Lily's hand, and though she wore gloves, she flinched slightly as if feeling a sudden warmth. "It's like they're remembering us," she murmured, and Thomas thought of the old stories in his grandfather's journal, tales of the souls of Eloria remaining as guardians and guides for those who were worthy. He reached out slowly toward one of the luminous beings, and hovered for a moment before gliding along his arm, leaving behind a faint shimmer like moonlight on water. They moved carefully through the garden, unwilling to disturb its stillness, feeling as though they were walking through a sacred place of memory. Eventually, they came upon another large mural, this one showing scenes of a great calamity, a shift from the joy and peace of earlier depictions. Towering waves reared up in the background as the people of Eloria stood at the shoreline, their arms raised in supplication or farewell. Dark shapes loomed beyond the horizon, indistinct but menacing, and Thomas felt a chill run through him despite the warmth of the water. The faces in this carving were still serene, but there was a solemnity to them now, a readiness for sacrifice. Lily traced the lines of the mural with her fingers, her brow furrowed. "They knew they were going," she said softly, "but they chose to stay, to protect something." She turned toward Thomas, her eyes dark with understanding. Maybe they became part of the city, to guard what's left. The notion made sense in a way that words could not explain. These murals, these whispers, were more than history. They were messages for those who would come after. For Thomas and Lily, and perhaps for others who might yet find their way here. As they drifted onward, they found carvings that hinted at something more, a prophecy, maybe, or a hope. Images of figures much like themselves, dressed not in flowing robes, but in simple garments, standing at the gates of Eloria, while the light of twin moons shone above them. There was a sense of completion in those final carvings, as though the story had always been meant to lead here, to them to be why the time they emerged into what appeared to be the city's central hall, a great domed chamber with a floor of mother-of-pearl that gleamed beneath their lights. Thomas and Lily felt the weight of the past settle around them, not as a burden, but as a mantle. They were not simply explorers uncovering a mystery. They were participants in a living memory, chosen or perhaps guided by something greater than chance. The air in the hall, if it could be called that, was thick with expectation. And as they floated to the center of the chamber, they found themselves before a great door, its surface carved with spirals and sigils identical to those in Thomas's grandfather's journal. In the center of the door was a hollow, shaped perfectly to hold the shell Lily wore around her neck. They exchanged a glance, hearts pounding, and Lily reached up to unfasten the cord. Carefully, she pressed the shell into place. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door shuddered faintly, and a beam of soft light spread outward from the point of contact, illuminating the chamber with a pale glow. The door began to open, not with a sound, but with a deep, resonant hum that Thomas felt in his bones. They had found Eloria. And now they were about to learn its final secret. The great door of the central hall slid silently open, releasing a pulse of light that shimmered like dawn upon still waters. Thomas and Lily floated cautiously forward, their breaths slow and measured, though their hearts raced with anticipation. Beyond the threshold lay a chamber unlike any they had seen before, vast and spherical, its walls carved from iridescent stone that seemed to pulse faintly with life. In the center of the chamber hovered a crystalline structure, shaped like an enormous drop of water, suspended in midair. Its surface glowed softly, and within its depths danced threads of silvery light, weaving together in graceful spirals. The chamber was utterly silent, yet the moment they entered, they felt an overwhelming presence, an intelligence that was gentle yet profound, ancient yet ageless. Thomas paused just inside the doorway, instinctively reaching for Lily's hand as they took in the sight. There was reverence in the space, an unmistakable sacredness that stilled them both. Slowly, as though summoned by their arrival, the crystalline structure began to resonate, emitting a low, melodic hum that vibrated through their bodies and seemed to speak not to their ears, but to their hearts. The hum deepened into a chorus of tones, harmonic and soothing, and soon the walls of the chamber began to display images, soft and translucent, like memories made of light. They saw the people of Eloria gathered in this very chamber, standing with solemn grace as a council of elders spoke to them, their gestures slow and deliberate. Though no words were spoken aloud, Thomas and Lily understood the meaning in their hearts, as if the knowledge was being gently placed there by unseen hands. The people of Eloria had known their time was ending, not by war or disaster alone, but by an inevitable tide that swept through all civilizations in their time. Yet they had not despaired. Instead, they had chosen to preserve their wisdom, their understanding of harmony and balance, and their belief in the greater good of life. They had gathered here, binding their collective essence, their hopes and light, into the living memory of Eloria, leaving it for those who might come after, the people above the waves, the inheritors of their dreams. Thomas felt a tightness in his throat as the images swirled and shifted, revealing scenes of Elorian life before the end. Great gatherings in open plazas, laughter carried on warm breezes, children playing in luminous pools beneath twin moons. There was beauty, but more than that, there was peace, a peace rooted in deep understanding and compassion for one another and for the world they inhabited. As the scenes faded, the crystalline structure brightened, and from it came a stream of symbols and shapes, flowing into the air and forming words in a language they somehow knew, though they had never learned it. The message spoke directly to them, its meaning clear, as if whispered softly into their minds. To those who find these halls, we offer not our riches of gold or gem, but the treasure of our knowing. We give you our light, that you may carry it forward. Let it be a lantern in your darkness, a guide in your times of doubt. Live in harmony. Guard the balance. And remember, all things return to the sea in time. Lily's eyes shone with unshed tears as she turned to Thomas, her voice a breath in the stillness. It's not about what we take back, it's about what we bring forward. Thomas nodded, understanding at last the truth his grandfather had spent his life searching for. Eloria's legacy was not the splendor of its buildings or the marvels of its craft, but its wisdom, its way of living with grace and purpose. This was the treasure they had preserved, waiting patiently through the centuries beneath the waves for those who might be ready to receive it. The crystalline structure pulsed one final time, and then a single thread of light reached out, gently wrapping itself around Lily's wrist like a bracelet woven from moonlight. Another tendril of light touched Thomas's chest, spreading warmth through him, as if filling his heart with something new, an energy both calming and invigorating. The chamber grew still again, but the light remained within them, a living part of the city's gift. As they turned to leave, the passage behind them seemed brighter, the murals along the walls now glowing more vividly, as if their understanding had awakened something in the stones themselves. They moved slowly, with reverence, feeling as if they had been changed in some quiet but permanent way. Rising back through the streets of Eloria, past statues whose faces now seemed to watch them with gentle approval, they retraced their journey toward the surface. The spirits in the coral garden drifted toward them once more, their forms brighter, their movement graceful, as if to say farewell. At last, they reached the edge of the city, pausing one last time to look back. In the distance, the central hall glowed softly, its dome like a second moon in the deep. Thomas touched the shell hanging once more from Lily's neck, feeling its warmth pulse beneath his fingers. "We'll carry their message," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his emotions. "We have to." When they broke the surface and climbed aboard their small boat, dawn was spreading across the sea in shades of silver and gold. The water around them gleamed as though reflecting the light they now carried within. Neither spoke for a long time as they removed their gear and sat in quiet reflection, the gentle sound of waves a soft chorus beneath the morning breeze. Finally, Lily opened her grandfather's journal, its pages now seeming more alive than ever before. She turned to the final entry, written in her great-grandfather's careful hand, and read aloud the last words he had written. "The heart of Eloria is not lost beneath the sea. It beats in those who remember." She closed the journal with reverent hands, glancing toward Thomas. "Now we understand." Thomas smiled, the lines of his face softening as he looked out over the horizon. The journey had brought him more than answers. It had brought him peace. "Let's bring it home," he said quietly. They turned the boat toward the distant shore, carrying with them not relics or riches, but a message meant for the living world above, a call to kindness, balance, and hope. Eloria's light, at last, had risen again. The soft hum of the ocean accompanied them as they rose slowly from the depths of Eloria, their bodies buoyed by the gentle pull of their ascent, but their minds weighted with the enormity of what they had seen and the promise they now carried. Thomas and Lily moved in tandem, their hands occasionally brushing in silent reassurance as they left behind the ethereal glow of the underwater city, its marble towers growing smaller and fainter in the blue-green murk of the sea. As they climbed toward the surface, it felt less like leaving and more like being sent, as if the very essence of Eloria had gently guided them away, content that its message had been received and was now carried forward. The water grew warmer with every meter, and the silvery light that had shimmered beneath the waves slowly gave way to the golden glow of late afternoon filtering down from above. Their tanks grew lighter, their lungs aware of the nearing air, but their hearts felt full, as if the weight they had carried for so long, Thomas's unanswered questions, Lily's longing for connection, had been lifted, transformed by the wisdom they now understood. Breaking the surface was like crossing from one world to another. They emerged side by side, drawing deep breaths as their masks slid back, and the salt air greeted them with its sharp clarity. The sea was calm, silvered in the dying light of the day, the sky streaked with hues of amber and rose. Their small boat bobbed gently where they had anchored, waiting like an old friend. Thomas hauled himself aboard first, his hands steady despite the tremor he felt in his chest, then helped Lily up, and they both sat for a long moment without speaking. The world around them was still, save for the rhythmic slap of the waves against the hull, and they sat drenched and quiet, gazing out at the endless horizon. Thomas turned his head slowly, looking at Lily as the sun caught her face, casting her features in a soft radiance that mirrored the light he still felt within himself. She smiled faintly, a knowing smile, as if to answer the question he hadn't yet asked. "It wasn't an ending," she said softly. "It was a beginning." They stowed their gear in silence, their movements instinctive, and Lily carefully laid her grandfather's journal in a dry place, pressing one hand on its worn cover with reverence. Thomas turned the boat toward the shore, the hum of the engine quiet against the vastness of the sea. They traveled slowly, neither in a rush to return, watching as the sky darkened and the first stars emerged, bright pinpricks of light scattered across the twilight. Silvermere appeared ahead, its familiar shoreline painted in muted shades by the setting sun. The cliffs, once imposing and lonely, now seemed softened somehow, as though they had been watching and waiting all along. The village nestled against them glowed warmly, its windows alight, a quiet invitation after their extraordinary journey. Thomas's thoughts drifted to his grandfather, the old stories, the maps, the drawings that had filled his childhood with wonder, and he found himself smiling softly, no longer haunted by the unanswered questions, but comforted by the knowledge that the old man had been right in more ways than one. Eloria had never truly been lost. It had simply waited for those ready to see it. As they drew closer to the harbor, Lily reached into her pocket and pulled out the small shell she had taken from Eloria's garden. It was smooth and pale, its spirals catching the dim light as she turned it over in her fingers. Without a word, she handed it to Thomas, who held it gently in his weathered hands. The shell was warm, as if it held a tiny ember of life, and he marveled at its simplicity. It was no artifact of wealth, no proof for the world to dissect and debate. It was something far more powerful, a quiet testament, a connection between worlds, a symbol of hope and continuity. He tucked it carefully into the pocket of his coat, patting it once as if to anchor himself in the reality of it all. They docked the boat with practiced ease, tying it to the weathered posts at the pier, and climbed onto solid ground as the first true darkness settled over Silvermere. The walk back to Thomas's cottage was slow and thoughtful, each step heavy with fatigue but lightened by the peace that now surrounded them. The village was quiet, its streets empty save for the occasional cat slipping through shadows and the distant sound of waves breaking gently on the shore. They passed by old stone walls, gardens gone quiet for the evening, windows glowing softly with lamplight. Familiar things. Yet each seemed different now, touched by the knowledge they carried, as if the entire village was part of something larger, woven into a story that stretched back beyond memory and deep beneath the sea. When they reached the small gate of Thomas's home, he paused with his hand on the latch and turned back to look at the ocean one last time. It lay dark and endless beyond the cliffs, but no longer mysterious in the same way. He saw not a barrier, but a threshold, a connection to something ancient and enduring. He sighed quietly, then opened the gate and followed Lily up the path. Inside, the cottage was warm and familiar, the smell of old books and salt air mingling comfortably. Thomas lit the lamp by the window, its golden light spilling over maps and journals that had once been the domain of dreamers and fools. Now they seemed like pieces of a puzzle they had finally solved. Lily set the kettle to boil, moving quietly, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet that had settled over them. When the tea was ready, they sat at the old table by the window, steaming mugs in their hands, and watched the stars over Silvermere Bay. They spoke little, exchanging glances that said more than words could. After a time, Lily opened the journal and began to write, her handwriting careful and deliberate as she recorded their journey. Thomas watched her, a sense of pride and gratitude filling him, knowing that she was now the keeper of the story, that it would live on in her words and actions. As the night deepened, Thomas rose and walked to the mantel where his grandfather's compass lay, its brass casing worn smooth by time and use. He picked it up and turned it slowly in his hands, then set it back in its place with a smile. He was right, Thomas said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The heart of Eloria was never lost. Lily looked up from a journal and met his gaze, nodding. And now it's found again. They sat for a while longer, until the kettle had grown cold and the lamplight flickered low. Then, with a final glance toward the sea, they climbed the stairs to their rooms, their dreams filled with marble towers and silver gardens beneath quiet waters. Eloria slept still beneath the waves, but its light now burned in them, carried forward into the waking world. They had returned to the surface, but they were forever changed. And so was Silvermere. Back in the quiet village of Silvermere, life returned to its gentle rhythm, but something had shifted beneath the surface, like a subtle current changing course far out to sea. Thomas and Lily found themselves watching the world with new eyes, every familiar sight now tinged with deeper meaning. The cliffs that framed their home seemed less forbidding and more like ancient guardians. The tide pools where Lily had once played as a child now felt like secret thresholds to places unseen. Word of their journey traveled softly at first, whispered between neighbors over garden gates and across weathered pub tables where fishermen gathered at dusk. Thomas never forced the tale on anyone, never demanded belief. He simply told it, calmly and quietly, his voice carrying the weight of truth and experience, his words painting pictures of marble towers gleaming beneath a silver sea, of ancient bells calling tides long-thought myth, and of a city's last gift to those who walked the earth above. And those who listened, some with skeptical smiles, others with furrowed brows, often found their gazes drifting toward the horizon as though they, too, hoped to catch a glimmer of something more. That on soft summer evenings, Thomas and Lily often sat by the rocky shore, their backs against sun-warmed stones, watching the sea stretch out in an endless expanse of blue and silver. The journal they had carried on their journey, now filled with new pages and delicate sketches of Eloria's gardens and statues, lay open between them as Lily's pen continued to move, recording not just what had happened, but how it had changed them both. Children sometimes gathered nearby, pretending to be deep-sea explorers, their laughter rising like birdsong as they imagined discovering ancient cities and ringing mystical bells. And though Thomas chuckled softly at their games, he never corrected them when they mispronounced Eloria or imagined treasure chests full of gold. He understood now that the treasure was not in coins or jewels, but in wonder, in hope, and in the stories that lit young eyes with possibilities. Lily took it upon herself to preserve the story for the generations that would come after them. In the evenings, she sat by lamplight, copying their notes into a fresh book with leather binding, embellishing the margins with delicate drawings, spirals like seashells, waves cresting in fine silver lines, and small figures standing at the edge of a shimmering shore. She included her grandfather's maps, both the fanciful ones and the ones that had guided them true. As she worked, she often thought of her great-grandfather, who had once believed in Eloria and who had passed that belief to Thomas. It seemed right that the story now found a home in her hands, a living legacy passed like a candle's flame from one heart to another. As months turned into seasons, the village of Silvermere subtly transformed. Tourists and scholars came at times, curious about the whispers of a lost underwater city. Some were charmed by the stories, some dismissive, but all found themselves lingering at the water's edge a little longer than they had expected. Local fishermen, once dismissive of Thomas's youthful dreams, now nodded solemnly when they passed him on the path. A few even swore that on calm nights they heard faint chimes beneath the waves, like distant bells calling out from somewhere deep and ancient. Thomas, for his part, never claimed proof or argued for belief. He only smiled, his eyes distant, and let each person find their own way to the truth point one crisp autumn evening, as gulls wheeled overhead and the sea glowed gold beneath the setting sun. Lily and Thomas walked down to the old pier where their journey had begun. Thomas carried the journal under one arm. Lily held a small bundle wrapped in cloth. At the end of the pier, they sat for a while, their feet dangling over the water as they watched the gentle rise and fall of the tide. When the light had faded to silver twilight, Lily unwrapped the bundle to reveal the seashell from Eloria, its spiraled surface gleaming faintly as if it still held some of the underwater city's quiet light. Without a word, she held it over the water and released it. They both watched as it floated for a moment, then slowly sank, spiraling down into the depths like a tiny, deliberate offering. "We carry their light," Thomas said quietly, his voice rough with age, but steady. "But some things belong to the sea." Lily nodded, her gaze following the last ripple on the water. "And some stories belong to the world," she replied. They sat until the stars appeared, bright and clear above them, mirrored in the dark sea below. The old bell of tides, still standing on the cliffs, had long since gone silent. Yet sometimes when the wind shifted, they both imagined they could hear a faint note carried across the waves, as if Eloria herself was singing to them, "Did I end time?" Lily's book became known beyond Silvermere. Travelers who had never set foot on its shores read of the lost city beneath the waves, of the people who had lived there in wisdom and peace, and of the simple message they had left behind, that hope endures, and that light, once kindled, never truly fades. Some readers dismissed it as legend, others found themselves believing it was true. And in quiet moments, those who believed would stand by lakes or oceans, watching the play of moonlight on water, waiting for a sign or a whisper from the deep. For Thomas and Lily, however, it was never about waiting. They had seen, they had known, and they had returned with their hearts forever changed. They understood that Eloria was not a place that could be reclaimed, but a truth that could be lived. And so, in their small village, they lived simply but fully, sharing their story with those who wished to hear, listening to the sea with reverent hearts, and knowing that the echoes of the city beneath the waves would never be silenced.